Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of the Tom Talks podcast with myself, Tom Randall. In this episode, I talk with Candace Ellison about international development. Our conversation ranges from the phenomena of voluntourism, microfinancing, and the importance of having a critical mindset in development projects. Candace is well qualified to help me understand these issues. She works as a bilingual donor care agent at Plan International Canada and speaks Spanish and French. She is also a postgraduate student at Humber College in Toronto, where she studies international development. Candace holds a bachelor's degree from Trent University, where she read international development studies with a specialization in Latin America. During that time, she spent a year in Ecuador for the Trent-in-Ecuador program. The conversation Candace and myself have may initially come across as fairly negative, given we critique various development projects around the world. But the message is actually a positive one. As Candace persuasively argues, having a critical mindset is not cynical or pessimistic, but necessary for development to keep improving. It was a fun conversation to have, and I hope you enjoy it. With that, I give you Candace. So with me is Candace Ellison. Candace, welcome to the podcast.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me to contribute.
So you started at Trent University and you did your bachelor's in international development with a specialization in Latin America. So when you first joined Trent University, what perception of international development did you have at that point?
When I was first a student in international development, I began with an ignorant point of view on the subject. I saw it as world issues based. I imagined development work almost like humanitarian relief work, hands-on in the field, working with, young people and children, ensuring that basic needs were met. Basically understood development from a basic needs approach, which is sort of where the industry began.
So that's very interesting in itself, because when you say that, the first thing that comes to my mind is the term voluntourism. Could you tell us what voluntourism is and how that sort of relates to what you just said?
Okay, so voluntourism is interesting. This is sort of a new phenomena that's come with increased inability to move within and outside of our countries. And it's something that's very popular among youth who have disposable income, and basically involves the movement of one person from their own country to another country to immerse themselves in another culture, to complete some form of hands-on work. It's typically building schools, building clinics, or it could involve like medical brigade work. There are different ways in which you can become a voluntourist. But basically, it's an industry built up of young people who pay to have experience in what is basically international development work in a very short-term window of time.
Right, so should we be cynical of voluntourism? Because I suppose the way that I view it is that you have, say, young people who are really, they're paying money to go to these various countries to help build the various projects that you mentioned. So it is a industry. Yeah, so money's being paid towards it, and then because of the short-term windows a lot of these people are going for, then can we really set out long-term goals, especially if you're building like a school which needs that long-term curriculum plan? And if you've just got people coming in and only staying there for maybe a month or 2-month window, that's not even a semester, right? And so is there a danger that this voluntourism could be quite harmful rather than good?
There is definitely a danger, and what's problematic is that the danger is not to the individual who is becoming a voluntourist. The danger is within the communities wherein that person is working or studying. So when I say danger, I don't mean physical harm. I mean that people are being actively put out of work so that a young professional or a student from somewhere in the global north can have the experience of taking over that person's position, whether that's as a contractor or a builder or a school teacher. No matter what the role is, there is someone from a community that's being pushed out of their livelihood in order for that person to take on a very short-term role within that community, and for that person to be empowered to be able to take on that role as someone who has little to no education in what taking on that role means.
So it is also the case that it has the opposite effect to what you think it would on the community. So you go there because you want to help, and so the good intentions are perhaps there, although maybe not sometimes, and I might get back to that. But supposing the good intentions are there that you want to help the community, maybe you're actually doing more harm than good because you cut out opportunities from the local residents.
Yes, so there's many different ways to look at this from different types of voluntourism. So if you're thinking of a young educator going into a role overseas wherein they take on the role of teacher, then it's of course what you said. They've taken on a former teacher's role within that school. It is short term. The students lose continuity in their education for those short periods of time, and maybe the education quality is not at its best. In a situation that's medical in nature, this could mean that a person is a nurse or a physician from the global north and they're going on a medical brigade overseas. This person might be putting someone out of work in the local area, or it could be harming the overall health system, because then a government becomes not only dependent upon, but expectant that foreign aid in the form of these medical brigades will come in and sort of place a band-aid over the primary health issue in that country. So you have economic issues associated with voluntourism. You have systems issues in terms of the breakdown of health systems or education systems, harming local populations in the long run. And then there's this like power differential that sits at the basis of all of this. You have what's probably a white young person, probably mostly females. That seems to be the dominant demographic, going overseas and being portrayed as someone who has the power to take on a role that they're not qualified for in a lot of cases, in order to, air quotes, help the population that maybe has the skills or the drive to be able to resolve the development issue in that community themselves, but is not the population being empowered to help themselves. So it takes away the development from within and places a focus on the international aid involved.
The places where these people are going then to help, it undermines their own resilience and self-determination, I suppose, in a way.
That's definitely one of the dangers. I'm not saying this is the case with all cases of voluntourism, but it's definitely something that needs to be more well thought out prior to. A lot of voluntourists might not have the skills in the field that they'll directly be working in overseas, but they also might not have the knowledge or the education to understand the impacts to the community and the country at large in terms of development or underdevelopment in this case.
So that almost brings us back full circle to the initial question we were trying to answer, which is when you began at Trent, you had this view of development which was almost like a basic needs view, I think you described it as. So what sort of ways can we overcome the problems with that industry? So how should we start to understand development differently?
This is something that has been thrown around a lot in lectures that I've sat in. And I think the overall point of view from global south perspectives coming into the classroom in the form of guest speakers, from educated professors, from other students in the classroom who have different life experiences, whether that be in Canada, the global north, or overseas, is that the solution at the basis of everything has to be a critical consciousness and the development of that critical consciousness. If you are able to think about the way that you live your life, the way that others live their lives, how the two connect, and in the case of voluntourism or development work or even humanitarian assistance work, how it affects the way that you do your job or undertake your volunteer position. Being critical is something that is healthy in this industry.
Would you be able to give an example of what critical consciousness would look like? Is there a case study that you can think of off the top of your head where we might witness a critical consciousness at play?
I know that this is something that especially people who experience a Western education system have a lot of trouble with, and for good reason, because the education system in the global north and in Western schools is very much based on this like banking concept of education, wherein you're sort of filled as a container as a student by someone who holds power over you, and you're supposed to passively learn what's taught to you. We're not taught to question, and we're not taught to wonder why when we see the things we see and we learn the things we learn, what might be problematic about these things. So in my case, I was almost unable to develop a critical lens until I traveled abroad to Ecuador to complete the Trent-in-Ecuador program. And I was able to immerse myself in a different culture and in a different context of learning that was more experiential in nature. And that's when I started to realize that it is valuable to actively question what you're being told and actively question what you're reading, and to sort of invite that into your life as a positive act. So whether that's, reading an article and seeing something that stands out to you as maybe untrue, maybe not fully true, but overall something to be questioned, to explore that and to be able to question. I don't know if that answers your question, but the development of a critical consciousness is something that has to be actively done by the individual and supported by the learning environment, whether that's in regular life or in a classroom. And it's as simple as questioning things.
So when we talk about critical consciousness, what it means is being able to question your own subjective view of the world. So I suppose the next question might be, how should we partake in helping good development?
If you're looking to do really impactful development, a lot of people will say that it's very good to start at the grassroots and in a context that you understand. It's almost comical how often it's overlooked that you should understand the geographic, the political, the social context that you're in before you immerse yourself in a position as a professional or a volunteer role in a foreign place, whether that's a foreign place within your own country with a people that you're not used to associating yourself with or working with, or whether that's overseas. So good development comes from the way that you work, but also the way that you manage yourself within the role.
And it sounds like as well that good development comes from the bottom up as well.
Yes, definitely. There has been tons of criticism of the international development industry for how top down it can really be. And a lot of that comes from the fact that international development is an industry that's funded in most cases by bodies in the global north, whether they're governments or multinational corporations or wealthy individuals. The money comes from a place of power in a certain part of the world. Funding comes with ties, it comes with ethics, it comes with a belief system. And now more than ever in the international development industry, funding bodies, especially governments, are being held more accountable for the way that the money that they donate or partner with organizations to provide is being spent. So taxpayers want to know how every last dollar is spent, and that means that the field has to have a conversation with basically head offices in the global north to explain what's happening and be able to report back that the way the project or the program was meant to play out based on an initial proposal in writing played out in that way. And if it did not, finding a way to skew what happened in reality to match what was meant to happen. So there is a lot of complexity in top-down versus bottom-up development, in the way that funding operates on the ground in international development, in the way that power structures between the funding body, the governing organization that creates the projects and the programs, and the field all work together.
One particular case though that comes to mind, and I'd like to hear what you think about this. Say you've got a particular NGO that goes to somewhere like Peru and says, we need to endorse various monetary schemes, maybe kind of microfinancing or giving microcredit to the women population. But if you've got various, I suppose what's called, I don't know the Spanish or how they term it, but it's all like this kind of machismo. Is that it? Machismo. Thank you. Where if their particular job, say if they're on the coast and they're fishing, but changing climate and the changing acid levels of the water, or maybe overfishing, is leaving many of these men without various jobs, but then the women in their household are receiving microcredits that's meant to empower them, then suddenly the woman becomes the breadwinner there, but then the men who have the view that they are the breadwinners and they haven't been exposed to the value and the importance of empowering women, it can lead to, in some cases, quite serious domestic violence because the men feel emasculated. So in this case, I think it was important that if you're going to pursue the things that are valuable in certain contexts, you need to do it from the bottom up, because if you just implement it, say if you're an NGO, from the top down, it doesn't translate too well in various communities.
Exactly. And so your example of microfinance has come up quite a lot in my studies over the past 5 years. And there are so many examples of how gender-blind microfinance projects, even if they are focusing on women and the empowerment of women, the gender blindness of leaving men out of the conversation or out of the project's boundaries of work has created, like you said, severe cases of gender-based violence, problems in terms of that power shift between men and women, harsh without education, like you said. A lot of times in the beginning, microfinance and women were paired as this ideal match in international development, because when the representatives of the banks in the field were knocking on doors, it was the women during the middle of the day who were home to answer the door, not men, because they were out of community working, or at least out of home working. So the knock at the door and the woman answering sort of sparked this idea that, hey, it would be great if we decided to empower women through microfinance, because number one, they're accessible, and number two, this could be a great way to give them power over loans. The second issue, just apart from the gender-based violence, is that oftentimes women are those who sign for the loan, but the money is not necessarily being spent by these women. It could also be spent by like male members of the family, and then the woman is at fault if the loan is not paid back on time, or if the money is mismanaged. So there's issue in that as well. And so it's very important in international development to ensure that a project is gender focused in a way that's gender transformative, and that's a wordy way of saying has looked at gender from all sides, and that the process has been well thought out prior to implementation, and that it's going to create an impact that is positive on the overall without basically the bad taste in the mouth at project end.
What's interesting about that is that it almost is recommending some of the opposite to what we're told, is that perhaps in today's society we ought to be gender blind, and we ought to treat everyone based on their merits rather than the particular identity that they have. Whereas in these cases where we're trying to implement, say, microfinancing, it's very important to not be gender blind. It's very important to be aware of, say, race differences and to speak it how it is. It's very important to be of the power differentials between various genders and speak it how it is.
I think it's complicated. I think that international development is done with great intention and, always has been. As we've already talked about, this is a helping industry, right? So we're looking to do impactful work that benefits everybody. Being gender transformative in our projects and our programs is not only important, it's basically essential to sustainable and impactful development, because it's been proved over and over again that incorporating men and women into a development project, not necessarily equally but equitably, yields results in terms of development when it's paired with proper education, when it's done sensitively, when it's done in a way that makes sense to the community. So this comes back to the bottom up and culturally sensitive nature of development. The issue here is that, it's not just gender that we need to be focusing on in terms of these like cross-cutting themes that come in and out of our project work. This is, being able to create development solutions that benefit both men and women, male and female children and youth. This is, development that needs to focus as well on persons with disabilities, on, LGBTQ plus individuals. So there are lots of different, I don't want to say special interest groups because that's so problematic, but there are lots of different vulnerabilities within individuals that cross-cut throughout development work that, if not acknowledged, if blind to, will derail projects actively. And it's very awkward to report back to a national office or a donor to say, hey, this didn't work because we were gender blind, or because, we forgot about persons with disabilities. It's not something that you can admit in this industry. It's, we don't talk about failure a lot, which is a lot of the reason why there's not a whole lot of learning. And, these issues come up in the first place because you have oftentimes in international development this obvious international component where you have, say, an NGO or a nonprofit or a civil society organization moving into a community that they maybe don't fully understand but have great intentions to aid. And the reason they don't fully understand them is because there's no money in a needs assessment. There's no money in a baseline report. So those initial documents and research that kind of build a project up from the start, those have to be completed prior to funding being secured. So the initial research that would educate an NGO, a civil society organization, or the group that's going to be doing the development on what that context is in its complexity and in its entirety, is underfunded. Often donors will have an idea of what they want to fund, and the NGO or the organization that is looking to do the development and is applying for the funding has the specific vision of what they think needs to be done. It doesn't always come from a place of in-depth research or in-depth understanding, but rather a surface level observation of that community. So there's a prime example that is focused on water, women, and children, which is these play pumps. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of these, but basically they're a water pump solution that are operated by the toy in the playground that the children run alongside while holding and then jump onto, and it spins. And as it turns, in this case, it pumps water from a well or from the water source into the spigot, wherein women can then collect the water within their water collecting receptacles. And this was seen by the global north as the success in water-based solutions or clean water-based solutions in the global south. And what they didn't think to look into was, would the children lose interest in the play tool?
Suddenly the women are the ones playing with, well, not playing, but having to operate these things to get the water to come up.
You hit the nail on the head, and that is exactly what happened in almost every case of this play pump being built and the project being implemented in these communities. All of a sudden, women are degraded by literally having to engage in child's play to then collect water that previously might have been pumped by a classic pump placed in that community by a different non-governmental organization in past, but was destroyed in favor of a global north solution that looked really great on an end of year review and got a gold star from the donor, but didn't make sense in the context, and ended up breaking down classic women's work in terms of water collecting, and making it more complicated. So this was a project that was gender blind. It was a project that underestimated, or I guess overestimated, I should say, children's interest in a single plaything.
That is one of those, well, I was going to say great stories, but one of those tragic stories that you just can't believe happened.
Because in the beginning, it seems really great. If you were to, publicize this and ask, a focus group of people from Canada or the US to comment on, they would say, wow, how transformative. This is going to be so incredible for this community. Children will have something structural to play with, and women will be relieved of their hours of water collecting work. And in end, really turns out to be a prime example of bad development and almost embarrassing development. And this happens a lot. So this industry is constantly trying to learn from itself without necessarily being open to acknowledging its failures. Although in recent years, and this is just something that's interesting to comment on, the existence of failure fairs or fail fairs has become a thing in development, especially in the global south, wherein NGOs and different bodies performing development work overseas are invited to a conference wherein only failure is discussed in a constructive way, so that other organizations can look in on bad development from other contexts and say, oh, we were going to do that, now we won't. Or, I never thought of that, but what about this?
So we've been very critically conscious throughout this talk, I suppose, and it might be good to end on a positive note.
Yes.
So is there anything in your work where you've seen good things happen through a developmental program?
Definitely. I think that in my studies and in the modest work that I've done in international development so far in my career, you see a lot of education of people who maybe wouldn't typically care or think to care about what's happening, in their backyard with indigenous populations or, homeless populations, or overseas with refugee movements and different things like that are happening in the world. Learning about these things because different international development organizations and local development organizations have public outreach campaigns that actively teach the public about what is happening. And so you have more and more people, not unlike myself, who are either sitting in a classroom or, reading an advertisement while they're traveling on the TTC in Toronto, or are, reading publications in the newspaper or online about development. And that never used to be the case. So I think that the fact that international development as an industry is becoming more well known and more well understood is important, but more so that the issues are being better understood so that there can be greater innovation and understanding in future. That's one of the high points, I think, of this industry and what it does. And then there's, all of the successes and development that you hear about, lowering of infant mortality rates in different countries as a result of the Millennium Development Goals, which weren't perfect but had their wins, and other strengths along those lines that are directly related to international development initiatives.
So it would be fair to say then that any kind of criticism that we've levied throughout our talk is all towards the end goal of better development.
Exactly. And I mean, I hate to sound like a cynic in this industry because it's built up of optimistic individuals. And I'm not one of those optimistic individuals, but I think that it's super important as an international development professional, as a consumer of reading material about development in the newspaper in general, as a development student or a politics student or an economics student, to be able to sit in discomfort about what's happening in the world and our complicity in what's happening in the world, our complicity in the work that we're doing, understanding our positionality within everything that goes on around us and how that plays into development is really important. It's not a negative thing. It's not necessarily even a super cynical thing. I think that it's just necessary.
Absolutely. And so that seems to be a really powerful statement to end on.
I think so too. And I think this last semester at Humber College finished the same way. We were asked to sit in our discomfort and to think and to learn. And I think that is the epitome of learning in international development as a student, as a professional.
Well, Candace, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Really interesting conversations, and I wish you the best of luck in your work.
Thank you, Tom. It's been an honor to be a part of the Tom Talk.
To keep up to date with the Tom Talks podcast, subscribe on iTunes and YouTube, follow on Twitter at Tom Talks Tweets, like our Facebook page, and visit thomaserandall.ca. Thank you to Candace for joining me for this podcast, and thanks to you, the listener, for your support.